We are counting down the 10 unmistakable warning signs every dying empire shares. The symptoms historians now see pulsing through America today. From slow economic rot and a vanishing middle class to spiraling spectacle and a fractured national identity, each of these signs is not just familiar, they are textbook. Our countdown reveals how ancient coin fraud became today's digital money printing, how bread and circuses return in new disguises, and how justice itself splits in two. Why these 10? Because every patient, from Rome to Britain, showed them right before collapse. The diagnosis is chilling, but the pattern is undeniable. Let us begin, starting with number 10. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire's currency began to erode from within. Silver coins that once held real value were quietly hollowed out. By the time of Emperor Aurelian, the Antoninianus, Rome's workhorse coin, contained barely 5% silver. To reassure a skeptical public, Aurelian stamped his coins with the bold mark 21, advertising their fixed but meager silver content. This was less reform than confession. The empire needed more coins to pay its armies, so it stretched each ounce of silver as far as it could go. Mint officials who resisted or cheated the system faced harsh punishment, but the deeper problem remained. Soldiers and merchants watched the silver vanish, prices jumped, and trust in money collapsed. Today, the method has changed, but the diagnosis is the same. Since 2008, the US money supply, M2, has surged by 250%. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, once under $1 trillion, soared past $8 trillion after 2020. New money appears not as coins, but as digital entries, conjured to meet obligations that taxes alone cannot cover. The pattern is unmistakable. When the state's promises outstrip its revenues, it quietly dilutes the currency. In every dying empire, the first visible organ to fail is the money. Once the ROT sets in, it spreads. In late antiquity, the Roman countryside emptied as small farms vanished into sprawling estates. Land once worked by families became the property of senatorial elites, who lived off rents and tax privileges rather than crops or craft. Historians like Peter Brown and Chris Wickham document how these latifundia and the notables who managed tax collection formed a new class of extractors, profiting from the gap between what the state demanded and what the peasantry could pay. The empire's fiscal machinery, stretched thin by war and inflation, relied on these private intermediaries. They squeezed the countryside, falsified accounts, and turned the tax system into a source of private enrichment. Today, the United States economy is dominated by a different kind of parasite class. Since the 1980s, the financial sector's share of corporate profits rose from about 20% to a peak of nearly 45% in 2006. Banks and hedge funds engineer complex derivatives, extract fees from every transaction, and profit from the expansion of credit itself. The Bureau of Economic Analysis charts a steady rise. Finance now claims a quarter to a third of all United States corporate profits, even as manufacturing's share shrinks. This is not production, it is extraction, rent-seeking on a national scale. The real economy is left to bear the weight, while the parasite class thrives on the flow of new money. This is the hidden engine behind the widening gap between rich and poor. In 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus stood before the Roman Senate with a simple proposal: limit the size of estates and return confiscated land to ordinary citizens. The response was not debate, but violence. Senators, led by Scipio Nasica, stormed the Capitol and clubbed Tiberius and over 300 supporters to death. Surviving commission records show how his reforms threatened a handful of families who controlled vast stretches of Italy. The land surveys and redistribution plans were halted. The message was clear: wealth once concentrated would be defended at any cost. The World Inequality Database charts a modern echo. In the late 1970s, the top 1% of Americans claimed about 10% of national income. By the year 2010, their share had doubled to over 20%, a curve that steepened as financial profits soared. The gap is not just about money, but about detachment. Like the Roman latifundia, today's fortunes grow behind gates and trusts, insulated from the struggles of the majority. When wealth escapes the gravity of society, the bonds that hold a nation together begin to fray. The data curve is not an abstraction, it is a warning, written in numbers and in blood. In the year 80 CE, Emperor Titus opened the Colosseum with a spectacle so vast it defied belief. 100 consecutive days of games followed. Gladiators clashed, exotic animals were slaughtered by the thousands, and the crowds, tens of thousands strong, watched from dawn until dusk. The poet Martial, in his book De Spectaculis, described marvels engineered to dazzle and distract. The cost was staggering, funded by imperial coffers swollen with spoils and the proceeds of debased currency. But the purpose was clinical. The Flavian dynasty needed to pacify a restless city, so bread and entertainment were dispensed in equal measure. Political frustration, economic hardship, even the memory of civil war, all dissolved in the blood and pageantry of the arena. Today, the formula persists, refined and digitized. According to Nielsen's Total Audience Report, the average American adult now spends more than 6 hours each day consuming screen media, streaming, scrolling, watching, and swiping. Sports leagues, celebrity galas, reality competitions, and endless feeds compete for attention. The sheer volume of distraction is no accident. In times of rising inequality and social strain, spectacle becomes a pressure valve. The masses are not offered solutions, but sedation. The state does not need to solve every grievance if it can simply keep the audience entertained. Bread and circuses once filled the Colosseum. Now they fill every pocket and living room. The symptoms never change, only the screens do. In the final years of the Weimar Republic, the streets of Berlin became battlegrounds for identity. Paramilitary groups, communists in red armbands, and nationalists in brown clashed over who counted as a true German. Detlef Peukert's studies document more than 300 deaths in political street violence in the election year of 1930 alone. Posters, graffiti, and leaflets flooded neighborhoods, each declaring a different vision of the nation's soul. The focus shifted from foreign threats to internal purity, class, race, ideology, gender. The Republic's energy, once spent on rebuilding or resisting external pressure, fractured into endless internal wars over belonging. A century later, the United States faces a quieter but no less consuming battle. Content analysis of news and social media shows a sharp rise in identity-laden language beginning in 2010. Race, gender, and cultural markers dominate headlines and campus debates. Pew's 2022 survey found that 65% of Americans describe cultural conflict as very strong, a level not seen in decades. The numbers track a transformation. Political fights now revolve less around policy or the outside world and more around who gets to define what it means to be American. The pattern is clinical. When an empire turns inward, external purpose dissolves. The fever of identity obsession is not a sign of health, but of a body fighting itself. The symptom never changes, only the labels do. In the 3rd century, Roman unity shattered along lines few could have imagined a century earlier. 3 emperors, Postumus in Gaul, Gallienus in Rome, and Zenobia in Palmyra, each minted coins bearing their own image and authority, each issuing edicts that claimed to be the law. Archaeologists have catalogued these rival currencies and inscriptions, proof that a single empire had split into competing realities. Inscriptions from Trier to Palmyra tell the same story. Citizens no longer agreed on who ruled or even what Rome was. The collapse of shared facts was not an abstraction, it was stamped in bronze and silver, passed hand to hand. The modern parallel is not minted metal, but information. Pew's 2023 survey found that only 14% of Americans who identify with one political party trust national media outlets favored by the other. Reuters data shows news consumption splintered into echo chambers. 2 citizens in the same city, exposed to different feeds, now inhabit separate worlds. The basic facts of an election, a pandemic, or a protest are no longer common ground. They are battlegrounds. Charts of institutional trust, once gently sloping, now plunge and fork like a river in flood. When a society loses its shared reality, every conflict becomes existential. The center cannot hold because there is no longer a center, only factions, each convinced the others are living in a hallucination. In Rome, this fragmentation primed the empire for elite civil war. In America, the numbers warn that common facts are vanishing, and with them, the possibility of peaceful compromise. In the twilight of Rome's power, the Senate became crowded with men who carried the title but wielded little real authority. Under Diocletian, the Senate's ranks swelled from a few hundred to nearly 2,000, as emperors handed out seats to buy loyalty and placate ambitious rivals. By the 5th century, honorary senators numbered in the thousands, and the title itself had become a consolation prize for those locked out of true power. The imperial bureaucracy mirrored this inflation, with new offices multiplying across the provinces, each promising status but diluting the rewards. Prosopography records more than 3,500 named senators in the late empire, most with little hope of real influence. The United States has engineered its own glut of credentialed elites. Since 1980, the number of PhDs awarded each year has climbed by 70%, reaching over 57,000 in 2022. Yet tenure-track faculty jobs have flatlined, with fewer than 4,000 openings annually. The result was 14 new doctorates for every slot, and a generation of scholars forced into contingent roles. Law schools produce 40,000 JDs each year, but elite legal positions remain stagnant. Turchin's models flagged this mismatch a decade ago, warning that too many aspirants chasing too few thrones breeds factional strife. When the supply of elites outpaces the demand for leadership, competition turns savage. In late Rome, this meant endless court intrigue and usurpation. In America, it means a swelling class of frustrated professionals locked out of the corridors of power, searching for new avenues to assert themselves. The numbers are not just statistics, they are pressure gauges, ticking up as the system strains to contain a surplus of ambition. In the late days of Rome, the empire's armies no longer marched for Rome alone. They marched for whoever paid them. The foederati system put power into the hands of outsiders. Entire Gothic tribes, led by chiefs like Alaric, were settled on Roman land and promised annual grain and gold in return for military service. These treaties were supposed to bind the Goths to Rome's fate. But when Rome fell behind on its payments, when the grain shipments stopped and the gold dried up, the bargain collapsed. In 410 CE, Alaric's forces, once Rome's defenders, stormed the city itself. Orosius and Marcellinus record how the Senate scrambled for last-minute tribute, but the city gates opened anyway. The world's greatest metropolis was sacked by men who had once worn the empire's colors. In 2007, as the Iraq War dragged on, the US military found itself outnumbered by its own contractors. Department of Defense records show 180,000 private contractors working alongside 160,000 uniformed troops, an army for hire, paid not by loyalty but by invoice. USA Spending.gov charts. Billions flowing each year to firms like Blackwater, DynCorp, and KBR. These companies provided everything from convoy security to intelligence, often operating under ambiguous rules and legal shields. At the height of the surge, the ratio of contractors to soldiers reached levels unseen since the mercenary armies of the 30 Years' War. The logic is clinical. When a state can no longer count on citizens to fill its ranks, when the call to arms goes unanswered, money becomes the last lever. The army becomes an expense line, not a civic duty. The risk is not just cost overruns or scandals, it is the slow erosion of loyalty itself. Rome's dependence on hired swords ended in sack and humiliation. America's experiment with the contractor military is still unfolding, but the numbers are clear. The patient is now paying strangers to defend its body, even as its own blood thins. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian ordered his jurists to tame the legal chaos of the Roman world. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental effort to distill centuries of edicts, opinions, and rescripts into a single unified code. Yet even after the culling, the digest alone filled nearly 900 pages of dense Latin, drawn from 2,000 earlier volumes. The full corpus, in modern critical editions, sprawls across 2,000 pages, a legal mountain that only the best trained specialists could climb. For provincial judges and bureaucrats, the law became a labyrinth. Over the next centuries, the Byzantine state was forced to rewrite and translate the code again and again, first into Greek summaries, then into the 60-volume Basilica, just to keep the machinery moving. The law was no longer a tool for ordinary governance, it was a fortress accessible only to a priesthood of experts. The United States has followed its own path into an administrative thicket. When the first Federal Register appeared in 1936, it ran to fewer than 3,000 pages. By the late 1970s, annual volumes regularly topped 60,000 pages. In 2016, the total reached nearly 96,000 pages. Even in recent years, the count remains above 70,000, each page a new layer of rules, exceptions, and cross-references. Congressional hearings in the 1980s called for sunset provisions, automatic expirations to prune deadwood, but agencies simply replaced old rules with new ones, and the tide kept rising. The regulatory state never forgets, it only accumulates. The burden falls unevenly. For ordinary citizens and small businesses, the complexity is a daily obstacle. Forms, filings, and compliance costs that few can navigate without help. For those with resources, it offers shelter, loopholes, waivers, and the expertise to turn the maze to their advantage. The rulebook grows not just to govern, but to insulate. When law becomes too dense to understand, it ceases to be a common standard and becomes a shield for those who can afford to master it. This is not accidental, it is the penultimate symptom of systemic failure. The patient is tangled in its own nerves, unable to move, yet unable to stop growing. In 70 BCE, the Roman governor Gaius Verus stood accused of crimes so brazen that even the Senate could not ignore them. Cicero, a young advocate from Arpinum, gathered evidence of extortion, torture, and theft across Sicily. The Verrian orations laid out a pattern: grain stolen from farmers, statues stripped from temples, citizens executed without trial. When the first hearing began, Verus simply fled Rome. He settled in exile at Massilia, he was fined but never imprisoned, and he lived out his days in comfort. The message was unmistakable. When justice confronted a powerful man, the law bent. That was the privilege of birth. The pattern survives. In the United States, the Sentencing Project reports that Black Americans are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than whites, over 1,800 per 100,000, compared to fewer than 400 per 100,000. For drug offenses, the gap is even wider. After the 2008 financial crisis, not a single chief executive from the largest banks went to prison. DOJ records show hundreds of billions paid in civil settlements, but criminal convictions were rare and minor. Kareem Serageldin, a mid-level trader, was the highest-ranking Wall Street figure to serve time, 30 months for mismarking assets. The architects of the collapse kept their bonuses and their freedom. That is modern impunity. The law's shadow falls unevenly. For street crime, the penalty is swift and severe. For white-collar fraud, the process stretches into years of litigation, ending in fines that barely dent corporate profits. Cicero's Rome called this dual standard the privilege of birth. Today, it is the privilege of wealth and status. The numbers do not lie. 1 in 81 black adults is behind bars. 0 top bankers have been jailed for the largest financial fraud in generations. When the law becomes a tool for the powerful, the social contract is void. The final symptom is not violence or spectacle, but impunity. Once the law no longer binds the elite, the patient is beyond saving. Across all 10 symptoms, one pattern emerges. Empires do not collapse from a single wound. They collapse from a cascade of the same systemic failures, economic, social, and legal, repeating across centuries. The warning is not theoretical, it is clinical. These patterns do not just diagnose the empire, they forecast the environment we must now survive. History shows the patient rarely recovers. Individuals, however, always have a choice. Your lifeboat matters more than the ship.